It's time to look at the Golden State Warriors, reviewing their 2019-20 season. Bit of a preview, I guess, of what they might be looking at in the off-season as well and heading into next year. Michael Bolton.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com and at Yahoo Sports Australia. And you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today's episode is also brought to you by rockauto.com. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Yesterday, we looked at the season review for the Minnesota Timberwolves. They had the number one pick in the draft. Well, they still do have the number one pick in the draft. Today, we're looking at the team with the number two pick in the draft, and that is the Golden State Warriors. Looking back on their 19-20 season, looking ahead to maybe some off-season things that they do, a really, really interesting team. And as I did yesterday, I'm going to start things off by looking or answering some questions that you guys threw at me either on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball on the stories over there or on the Twitter account as well. So let's start with some questions here from Instagram. Zachary underscore Craig, very similar question to what I got from Jordan K. Lloyd. Thank you, Jordan, for sending that in. Questions from Jeffrey A. Ballon. Questions from Johnny1341. Yeah, very, very similar questions. Isn't it? What the hell do they do with their draft pick? And what do they do with Andrew Wiggins? That is the common question that's been asked. Now, the idea that's always seems to be floated around is that they'll just trade the pick. They'll trade it out. Is anyone really that keen to get up in this draft class? I don't think it's that good. Now, there are stupid teams everywhere. Like the Bulls, they could easily do it. Although Karnisovas, who knows what his idea is going to be with this draft. Do the Pistons trade up? Do the Knicks make a dumb move? You got to, in order to trade down, someone has to be willing to trade up, and they have to be willing to give you assets to do that. So I think they're not getting Bradley Beal for the number two pick. They're not getting Devin Booker for the number two pick. Like they're not getting Joel Embiid for the number two pick unless they're throwing Klay Thompson in that deal. Like these things just aren't realistically happening with this team. I think ideally, if they can get a solid deal for that number two pick, they do it. But I'd be more inclined just to keep the pick and see what they can do with it, because there might be demand for that player later in the season. If that player performs, it gives them, their bench is pretty rough. It might give them a guy who can be sort of reliable in that bench unit and then can develop and in 3 or 4 years time start to take over some of their roles, because their young player group isn't all that strong. They've got a bunch of their guys, best year is probably going to be next season, and then it's all downhill from there. You know, look, that's in terms of looking at the next 5 years, the best year of the remaining of most of these guys is next season. And then it's just going to continually go down from there. So getting that young player in. So to answer the question from many of you, what should they do at pick number two? I think that look, I would take LaMelo Ball at number one. I don't think that's going to happen. So therefore, LaMelo Ball is going to be available at number two. I think you just take LaMelo Ball. I'm not a big fan of James Wiseman. I would just be taking LaMelo at that pick. Who is their backup point guard at this point? Kai Bowman, do you want to trust him to be backup point guard? God, no. Michael Mulder, Jordan Poole, like who is their backup 1 and 2 on this team? Like, he is not a good player. And while Melo's got some massive issues with shooting, just take him. Get another ball handler in there to play alongside Klay, to play alongside Steph, to have an opportunity to grow in an environment where his role is going to be fairly limited early on. But he's on a championship level team, who this team should be right back into that discussion next season. I think that's what they should do with that pick, is if it is LaMelo that's falling down there, that they take it. Now, in my mock draft, I had them taking Anthony Edwards there because I took LaMelo at number one, but that's because I didn't include trades in that draft. Yeah, I wouldn't be adverse to them trading down and getting Denny Avdia to Onyeka Okongwu, Killian Hayes, all those guys I think could make sense with this team. But if you're available there at 2 and LaMelo Ball is there, that's sort of the direction I would go. Mitchie Gray says, where should we rank Steph Curry for next season? Top 10. I really don't think there should be much debate about him being a top 10 guy. Yeah, look, the season was rough. He played 5 games. He played just 28 minutes a game, but he was still the 24th ranked player in that time. So until further notice, I think he is a top 10 guy. You probably don't want to go with him in the top 5 at this point. But yeah, there is some obvious injury concerns. He's 32 years of age. At some point, a drop-off is going to come for Steph. I reckon he's probably got 1 or 2 years left at this high level. And I think he's still going to be a top 10 player. Ben HG says, there any relevance for Marquise Chris in 12-team leagues next season? Now, Chris, after the All-Star break, played 9 games, and he was the 61st ranked player. He put up some good numbers. Will they feel comfortable with him as their starting center next season? I reckon they might. Kevon Looney was trash this season, but he's still around, and I think he can still be a pretty good player. So I think we can have a look at Chris as a 12-team option. Now, I've been fairly critical of Marquise Chris in the past because he was dreadful. But he did improve quite a bit. He still has significant defensive problems. He still isn't a shooter. And his overall season value, he was only 140th ranked player. But that's in 20 minutes a game. So yeah, I think at this point, we should be feeling that they will play him 22 to 23 minutes, whether that's starting or coming off the bench. And he can have some sort of an impact, I believe. Now, as to the question about Wiggins, will he fit in their system? The results from him coming across after the trade weren't great. He was the 118th ranked player in that time. He played 34 minutes. He had 18 points, 26 usage. That's with no Clay and no Steph. So that usage is going to drop. It's going to drop pretty precipitously. And I just don't know. Now, his defensive numbers were good there. I think he can play better than he did in Minnesota at times. But will he be good? I don't think so. Who's going to want to trade for him is the other question. I think he's got to be considered a negative asset at this stage. So that's hard to get a huge amount of value out of Andy Wiggins. So I think he's going to be more relegated to a spot-uppy type role, and that's not really in his best interest, as we saw when he had to take that role on in Minnesota when Jimmy Butler was there, and he struggled with it. Can he work on his defense? He was better defensively this season. There's no doubt about that, but the shooting is still rough, and I really worry about how he fits not only on this team, but in a bunch of teams across the NBA. Let's go and have a look at some of the questions that came through on Twitter. Let's have a look. Who starts at center from Jonathan Chandler? That's still up in the air, John, because we've got, we don't know what's happening with the draft pick. Look, even if they draft Wiseman, they don't throw him in day one as a center. What do they do in free agency? Doubt they target anyone there. I think it probably is going to be Marquise Chris. Dean Taylor, Dino, he says, is there any precedent set for performance drop-off following injuries such as that as Steph and Clay had? Now, let's start with Clay, who tore his ACL. Yes, absolutely. Now, most times, players who tear their ACL with no other injuries and no other history of those injuries, they bounce back, but not straight away. Ricky Rubio tore his ACL the first bit when he came back, pretty rough. Zach LaVine's first season coming back from an ACL, pretty rough. Jabari Parker's first season coming back from an ACL, pretty rough. Jabari then did it again and never been the same. LaVine, he's back at the same level, if not exceeding it later on. So I think that Clay, who's not completely relying upon explosiveness and athleticism, I think he'll be fine. Yeah, it might be a little, and this often happens, and I say not reliant on explosiveness, but shooting, so much of it comes from the legs. And we see that as a relatively common thing with players coming back from ACL injuries, is their shooting percentages tend to be off for the first half a season or full season. And I think that could be a worry for Clay over the first 6 months or first 3 months of the season. That's a worry. Steph, I'm not really worried about. Yeah, broken wrist, it wasn't good for him. There was no rush to get him back. He did return. I'm not really all that concerned with Steph and his injury as we move forward. I think he'll be fine. The worry with him is he's 32 years of age, probably close to 33 by the time, or he'll be 33 at some point next season. That's the bigger worry, not the fact that he had a significantly broken wrist at the beginning of the season. Ross Bennell says, can you look forward to, he says, I'm looking forward to it. Cool. Can you see Eric Paschall being able to improve in defensive stats and three-point shooting? Well, I think we'll talk about him later. Can he improve in three-point shooting? God, I would hope so, because he shot 29% from three. So he will have to get better than that. Will he ever become a good three-point shooter? I'm not sure. Low volume, low efficiency is a worry. Defensive stats are also piss poor. I'm not that convinced that the defensive numbers come in for Paschall. I really worry about his long-term upside. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But yeah, I think his three-point shooting, yes, will improve the defensive stats. I doubt it. Jonathan Mandelbaum says, what are the chances Andy Wiggins has a top 75 finish in 9-cat leagues? I would say almost zero. He was 75th this season, right on the button. in a situation where he was on a Minnesota team where he had the ball a lot more and then moved to Golden State, which was a team that was playing without Steph and without Clay. I really don't see Andy Wiggins being a top 75 player for this upcoming season. Other questions. Let's have a look. What else we've got coming through here? We'll talk about Damian Lee a little bit later. Ash says, Steph, Lillard, or Trey in redraft. I got no idea at this point. Let me go through do those projections at this point. Does Jordan Poole show any flashes to you? Look, he was one of the worst players in the NBA this season. He shot horribly. I thought he showed a little bit towards the end of the season, but the fact that the Warriors were playing guys like Michael Mulder and Juan Toscano Anderson and Kai Bowman ahead of him when they could have just been pumping minutes into Poole was a little bit of a concern. For a guy that was a 40% three-point shooter at Michigan, he was a 28% shooter in the NBA, so that's obviously a worry. I think he's just lacking too much to be a consistently good NBA player or good fantasy player. Last question here, before we get into actually talking about these players a bit more. Lit Trubisky, probably not your real name. Does Draymond slip and exceed his ADP next season? I think that's almost a guarantee, to be honest. His ADP this year was 33. He was the 78th ranked player. It's going to be outside the 50s, I would almost guarantee. And I think that he's got an ability to jump back into the top 40 for this season. He clearly didn't try this year. He had fake injuries. He played only 28 minutes a night. The shot was way off. His shooting was horrible this season, Draymond Green. I think that there's almost zero chance that he finishes worse than he did last season, where he was 78. And I think he's a massive chance to beat his ADP, unless that becomes a prevailing thought and that pushes his ADP up, which happens quite often. He's going to be a sleeper. He's going to beat his ADP, and then ADP rises and he doesn't beat his ADP. And I think that's probably the only risk you have there with Draymond Green. Something that's not a risk, though, is buying auto parts from rockauto.com. Why would you go into your local chain store, talk to the bloke behind the counter, and then he tells you, sorry, mate, don't have the part. Goes on his computer, has to look it up, orders it in, and then it costs you an arm and a leg because you're not a professional. RockAuto.com has the same prices for professionals and for do-it-yourselfers, and you can order these products from the comfort of your own home. RockAuto.com is a family business serving auto parts customers online for 20 years. Go to rockauto.com to shop for auto and body parts from hundreds of manufacturers. As I said, those prices, they're always at rockauto.com, reliably low. And the price is the same for professionals and for do-it-yourselfers. Why would you spend up to twice as much for the same parts? So go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your car or truck, and write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so that know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need, rockauto.com. All right, so let's get into talking about these players now for the Warriors. We'll start with Klay Thompson. Of course, he didn't play a game this season. We didn't get to see him on the court, so he has no advanced numbers. Now, historically, advanced numbers have hated Klay Thompson. He hasn't really ever put up good ones, and that's sort of the case here when you're looking to forward project what he can do. Like, his PIPM projections moving forward aren't strong. His wins added total aren't strong compared to other guys. Like, it comes out projected lower than someone like an Andrew Wiggins. His fantasy value over the course of the last couple of years has been relatively consistent, but it's also consistently dropped off. In 14, 15, 12, Klay was the 12th ranked player, then 25th, then 34th, then 41st, and then 42nd last season. That's because not only has his volume of three-pointers made come down, but the relative value of three-pointers has come down because everyone's hitting them at a high rate. And he doesn't get rebounds, he doesn't get assists, he doesn't get steals in really big bunches, he doesn't block shots in high amounts, he doesn't get to the line at high amounts, even though he's a good free throw shooter. He relies heavily on the scoring and the three-pointers. And as the value of three-pointers comes down, then the value of what Klay does comes down as well. Go back to the 13-14 season, he hit 3.1 triples per game. That had a Z score of 1.92. In 18-19, he hit 3.1 triples per game, and that had a Z score value of 1.61. So we're already losing value on him doing the exact same thing. And if it continues again next season and he hits 3.1 triples again, maybe the Z score of it's 1.4 or 1.5, and that does cause a drop-off for Thompson as we move forward. He's 30 years of age as well, same as Draymond, so you don't expect defensive stats or rebounds or assists to really pick up. I think there'll be a little bit of a shooting drop-off early in his season next year as he returns from the ACL, and to me, he's a guy that probably doesn't have another top 50 fantasy season in him, and maybe has another 2 or 3 as a 70 to 80 ranked guy. I think that's sort of where he is, because there's just not much else outside of that three-point shooting that he provides from a fantasy point of view. Let's look at Steph Curry, because it was obviously a horrible season for Steph. We thought, okay, no Durant, what is Steph going to be able to do on this team? Could he be a top 5 player? I thought he could be. He obviously wasn't, because he played only 5 games and he played only 28 minutes in those games. He still was, despite playing just 28 minutes, the 24th ranked player, and despite shooting an abysmal for Steph, 40% from the field and 25% from 3. He still averaged 21 points. He had 6.5 assists. He had 5 rebounds. He had a steal. He didn't miss a free throw and got to the line 5 times per game. So a lot of his strengths were there. But you bring that 40% field goal back to 48, the 25% from 3 back up to 41, 42, then the 21 points jumps to 28 points, and it looks pretty bloody sexy. So I think, yes, he is that top 5 player again, as I mentioned earlier. He still had a really strong Raptor. His PIPM was okay. He had 34 usage. His true shooting was 56. And look, the usage probably does come down a little bit now, depending on what they do with pick 2, but also having Clay there for a full season. That'll drop some of his value off. But Steph should be pretty bloody good for this coming season and for the next couple of seasons, although I do think that this 2020-2021 season will be the best season left in Steph Curry's career. That's not an outrageous statement, considering he is 32, going to be 33, but the value will start to drop off for Steph. But I think he can hold his value for 3-4 more years at the very least. The next guy we take a look at on this list is Andy Wiggins, who, as I mentioned earlier, was the 75th ranked player in fantasy this season, but with the Warriors, it wasn't that good. His PIPM was a negative, his Raptor was a negative, his true shooting was well below average, and he had a high usage, and now he has to adjust to playing with Steph and playing with Klay Thompson. In those games for the Warriors, he did have 1.2 blocks and 1 steal per game, so that is encouraging there. Which was marginally better than what he did all season, where he was at a block and 0.8 steals, which is an encouraging thing. The problem is his free throw percentage reverted, again, 65%, despite being at a really good number, a solid enough number through the season, 71, and it can't really do too much else. 54% true shooting is not a good number, and at this point in Andrew Wiggins' career, this is just sort of who he is. 33% three-point shooter. He's going to be a tertiary option on offense most of the time. Can he maintain that level of defensive production? Can he improve his rebounds and assists? Maybe. He did improve them both last season, but I'm still not convinced that that's going to be an ongoing thing for Wiggo. I reckon he's probably going to find it hard to be a top 100 player again this season. He's, as I said, 25. It's going to be 26 next season, and this is probably going to be his best remaining season, most likely, given where he sits or where he is in the league. His other advanced numbers aren't particularly encouraging, and I think, he'll figure it out. He's got the athletic ability to be a good defender. I just think at this point, we sort of know who he is, and this is who he is. Maybe he has a weird shooting improvement season, but at age 26, it's probably not all that likely. Next up is Draymond Green, who, as I mentioned, was the 78th ranked fantasy player. Just abysmal numbers. 8 points, 6 rebounds, 6 assists, 1.4 steals, and 0.8 blocks. Shooting 39% from the field and 76% from the line, and 28% from 3. That is a true shooting of 49%. Horrible. A usage of 16%. Look, Draymond's never going to have a big usage. We think we're all well aware of that. But he's also not most likely going to be a 39% shooter. He's not going to be a guy that's under 1 block a game all that often, and he's not going to play 28 minutes a night. So he's going to be able to improve, I think, quite a bit this season based on where he was this year. I expect a pretty big bounce back from Draymond. As I said, I think he can be a solid player for the next 2 years at least as a top 50 fantasy guy. Maybe it starts to drop off after that. But I think he's got some massive value still left in him. And I think we can almost, not completely, but almost just throw away what he did in this 19-20 season, given the scenarios around it, the way he played, the way his effort was, his injuries, his teammates' injuries, his lack of playing time. He should be a much, much improved player for this upcoming season. Well, God, you'd hope he would be, because he was pretty trash most of the year. Damian Lee was the next highest ranked Warriors player, 124th ranked player. He played 29 minutes a game and he averaged 13 points per game, which is pretty okay. Strong PIPM at 0.89, strong Raptor, true shooting at 55, usage at 19%. He started the season for big chunks of it at the 2 or the 3, but of course the starting 1, 2, and 3 is going to be Curry, Clay, and Wiggins now. So where does that put Lee? He is going to be the best of their bench guards, almost undoubtedly, and he could probably still get 24 to 25 minutes a night. But was this the best level of Damian Lee that we'll ever see? Yeah, probably. He's 28 years of age already. He played 29 minutes and had a 19 usage. I think that scoring goes down, the playing time goes down, the usage goes down. He still can be a relatively impactful guy, to a degree over the next year or two. But I think if you're looking long term at what Damian Lee does, is he a starter caliber player in the NBA? Probably not. He was in a situation which was really the best for him for this coming season, or this last season that just went through, obviously. And took advantage of that to a degree, but still only scored 13 points per game. I'd expect a pretty significant drop-off for Damian as we move forward. Even though he did have some impressive moments this season, I'm just not sure that he's someone that we look at as anything more than like an eighth man. Let's talk now about Marquese Chriss, because we've talked about him already, but he did have some impressive moments. PIPM as a positive, Raptor was a slight negative, but this is a guy who's been trash in those areas for many, many years. A true shooting of over 60%, a usage of 19%. He blocked a shot per game. He really picked it up after the trade deadline as well, where he was scoring 13 with 9 boards and hitting free throws at 83% as well. He was at 77 from the line all season, so he has improved that area. Now, 21% from 3 is horrible, but he didn't take them. And in the past, he'd be a horrible three-point shooter, and he'd take them at a way too high volume. His shot selection was terrible. He figured that out. And that's really a credit to him. He figured out some of the dumb fouls, which held him back a lot as well. And that's, again, a credit to him. He only averaged 2.1 fouls per 20 minutes. This is the guy that would pick up 5 fouls in 9 minutes in so many games, or get ejected and get texts and just be a genuine dumbass. Still, I think there are concerns with some of his defensive stuff, but he's established himself as an NBA rotation player at the minimum, and I reckon he would be the odds-on favourite to be their starting centre next season. Whether that's big minutes or not remains to be seen, but I reckon he's got an outside chance of being a top 100, at the very worst, probably top 120 player over the course of the season. I thought he was relatively impressive given where he came from, and definitely resurrected his career, because things were looking pretty rough for Chriss after the Phoenix and then Houston situations there. He looks a lot better in Golden State, and looks to have worked out what he can do and what he can't do, and focus on doing and not doing those two things, which is a massive thing for a young player to understand. Chriss is still pretty young. He's only 23, so a lot ahead of him. He's younger by 6 months than Eric Paschall, which is pretty astonishing when you think about what the relative value of those guys appears to be across the NBA. Let's talk Paschall, who was the 196th ranked fantasy player. He played 28 minutes a game. He averaged 14 points. And then I don't really know what else he did that was good. He shot 50% from the field, so that's maybe a bit unfair because that's pretty strong. 77 from the line, pretty solid as well. 29% from 3 is rough. Half a 3 made is not good. 4.6 rebounds as a power forward. 2 assists, half a steal, and 0.2 blocks are all really bad numbers. His advanced numbers are also horrible. Negative 3.39. He's in one of the worst 20 players in PIPM in the NBA. Raptor, similarly, thinks he was pretty poor. Negative 4.5. True shooting at 57 is good. Usage at 21% is a good number for a rookie. But I've mentioned this, I do not think he was deserving of that first team or rookie spot. He did a great job of carrying this team at times when he was forced into a larger role than he is going to be expected to have. I do not think that he is a long-term small forward. Again, he's almost 24. He's about to turn 24. He's not super young. His defensive issues are a problem. His shooting issues are a problem. I think that the value of Eric, and I could be very wrong on this, he could really turn things around and push and become a starter. And there are plenty of Warriors players who think this guy can become Warriors fans who think this guy can become an all-star. I do not see that in the slightest. I think there's a real chance that this rookie season that Paschall had is going to be the best season that he has in the next 3 or 4. And that he, in his bench role, which is what he's going to be in, he's going to be in a bench role, is going to show up, and in a low usage role, it's going to show up his other issues. If he doesn't have the ball a whole ton and he's trying to generate scoring shots, then what else is he doing? Is he defending? Is he being a marksman? Is he being a distributor? And to be fair to Paschall, his passing did improve as the season went on. Post All-Star break, over 4 assists. And that's where it's got to come. So that, I guess, gives us some glimmer of hope, because he averaged 2 assists through the course of the season. That 4 assists per game is a massive green light for us. If that can continue, that's where that value for him can come. But the absolute absence of defensive numbers is a concern. He did also, to be fair, improve his 3-point shooting as the season went on, so that's an encouraging sign there. But even in all that, when I'm talking about post All-Star, where he averaged 17, 4, and 4, He was the 132nd ranked player in 32 minutes a night. Like, what? Where does he need to come from? Because he's not hitting threes, he's not getting steals, he's not getting blocks, and he's a poor rebounder. So his overall upside to me is pretty low. I would absolutely, if I had him in Dynasty Leagues, be looking to maximize the hype around Pascal, the giddy glee that people have when talking about young players and completely overestimating their future. I could be very wrong on him. I admit he had some really, really good moments this season, but when you look at the numbers, when you look at the totality of what he did, I think that it's somewhat overrated. And that's not to say that he's bad, because I think he's a really solid rotation player who can be a 6th or 7th man and a starter in a pinch for years to come. But being touted as a next star, I think is pushing it too far. And that's what it's about when you're looking at value of players, is trying to work out where someone is overvalued and taking advantage of that. I think Pascal could really fit into that. Juan Toscano Anderson, 216th ranked player. I thought he was pretty good, but he's 27 years of age. He played 21 minutes. I thought he competed hard defensively, but realistically, he's not a guy that you expect to be a long-term rotation player. -2 Raptors, not a superb number. His PIPM in the G League wasn't great either. We're going to talk about someone who did have some pretty good G League PIPM numbers a little bit later on. But Toscano Anderson, I thought, for this team was strong, but what does that really mean going forward? Probably nothing. Kai Bowman, another player like Pascal, who I think was pretty significantly overrated this season. He was the 225th ranked player. He had a PIPM of -2.69, a true shooting of just 49%, and a usage of 17%. He averaged only 3 assists despite being a starting point guard for most of the season. He did hit his free throws well, but never got to the line, under 1 free throw attempt per game. And I just think that if you want to rely upon him to be your starting point guard, to be your backup point guard, you're not doing a great service to your team. And that is why I think if LaMelo Ball is available, that they should be looking at grabbing someone like Melo to slide into that backup point guard role. Bowman had moments. They sent him back to the G League at times. He did come in and put up some good steal numbers post All-Star break, 1.6 per game. How reliable is that? I'm not that sure. He also shot 17% from 3 post All-Star break, which is undoubtedly horrible, and 31% over the course of the season. He is, again, 23 years of age as a rookie. I think he's one of those guys that maybe floats around for 2-3 years as a 2nd or 3rd string point guard, but I don't really have much faith in him long term to be a strong rotation piece in the NBA. Next guy up is Dragan Bender, who I thought in his time with the Warriors looked okay. 16 games, 18 minutes, 7 points, 0.6 blocks. Now, one thing we know about him is he's a horrible fantasy player. He just doesn't put up good numbers. He played 22 minutes a night after the break and was still the 228th ranked player. I think we can have any hopes of him being a good fantasy player are cooked. He's an unrestricted guy at the end of the season, signed a couple of 10 days at the end of the season for the Warriors. He had a true shooting of 55. He had a PIPM, which is -0.45, which was okay. But the encouraging thing there was his PIPM in the G League was really good, 2.84, really good numbers. Has he shown that he can be at least on an NBA roster? Yes. Is he any hope to ever have a top 200 fantasy season? I would say almost zero chance of that. He just isn't a guy who puts up strong numbers on a consistent basis. And he had some games this year where he had these weird performances, which were obviously outliers, but again, that name and the number 4 pick pedigree does tend to stick with a lot of these players. He had a game where he had 13-9 with 3 blocks and 3 triples. He had a 14-5 game. His last game before the season shut down, Dragan Bender, had 23-7 in 25 minutes. Really, really good stuff. But I just don't trust it in terms of consistency. With Bender, he had that 3-block game and then never blocked a shot again for the rest of the season in the next 5 games. He's turned into a more reliable 3-point shooter, which was a concern with him. He takes some threes, hit him at 35%. It's not great, but he's shown some ability. So I think he's gone from being not an NBA caliber player to at least a rotation-ish type guy. Michael Mulder signed on at the end of the season, only played 7 games, but a whopping 29 minutes a game. And when I talked earlier about Jordan Poole, it was the fact that they were giving 26-year-old Mulder so many minutes and not giving them to Poole was a red flag to me. Now, he had 2 threes a game, Mickey Mulder, only at 31%, which is a worry. True shooting at 53%, but the advanced stuff liked him. His G League advanced numbers were pretty strong as well, 1.76 PIPM there. But at 26 years of age, I reckon you might get 2 years from him in a role sort of next to a Damian Lee as a backup 2, backup 3 sort of a player to come in and bang some threes, similar to what Matt Thomas did for the Raptors. And that could be valuable for a Warriors team that's looking to make a playoff push and a deep playoff push next season. But overall, his long-term value, I don't think is all that spectacular. The next player is Jordan Poole, who was the 329th ranked player. His advanced stats were rough, not worse than Pascal's, but pretty rough still. Minus 3.11 PIPM, 45 true shooting on 21% usage. After the All-Star break, he was better. 27 minutes, 14 points for Jordy Poole in that time with, and that's the most encouraging thing, 4.3 assists. Played him at point guard. Didn't hit his free throws very well. Did improve his three-point shooting. He did improve from being almost the worst player in the NBA to being a solid enough rotation guy, but I would have liked them to play him a little bit more. I think there's enough there. If he can develop some of that ball handling skill. Now, they tried to do it with Jacob Evans and it didn't work. They tried to do it with Poole, and I reckon that they had some success with that. So there is a little bit of a glimmer of hope there for Poole. Do I think he can develop into a long-term starter? Probably not. And I think he's probably 4 or 5 years away from playing his best basketball. So it is a long-term investment. But I think maybe he could be a sixth man, 27 minute a night, 14 point per game guy with 4 assists. I think he maybe could get to that level at some point in the next 4 or 5 years. But it does feel like it's a long way away from Jordan Poole. It was a write-off early in the season, but he did turn it around towards the end of the year. Last couple of guys to talk about. Kevon Looney, just one of the worst seasons that you could imagine for a bloke who had every opportunity to come in, be a 27-minute-a-night starter at center, really show what he did in the playoffs weren't a fluke, and he just couldn't do anything. 13 minutes a night, 20 games played only, consistent injuries. He shot literally an astonishing 37% from the field, a true shooting of 40% for a big man who should be hovering around the 60s. He hit 7% of his threes. We thought maybe he could extend out there. Defensive numbers went completely AWOL. It was just one of the most baffling seasons you could ever see. PIPM in the toilet. Raptor, horrible. Now, that seems to be a little bit of an outlier in terms of where he's been in previous seasons. Now, I wouldn't be saying that we rely upon him to be a 28-minute-a-night starting center, because I reckon with the hip injuries, the consistent problems, the play of Chris, that ship's almost sailed. But I still think there is some real value in Looney in deeper leagues for the next couple of seasons. Hopefully, fingers crossed, he's able to stay healthy and contribute, because he's still only 24 years of age. There is still some value to come from him. But in terms of ever getting back to being a top 100 player or getting into that zone, maybe even top 150, I reckon that's going to be pretty tough to rely upon. Let's talk about Chasson Randle for a second, because why not? He was on this team. He played 3 games, and we don't have to talk to him about him ever again, unfortunately for him. And then I've misplaced my graphic on Alen Smailagic, but let's talk Smailagic anyway, who is still only 20 years of age, just turned 20. Averaged 10 minutes and 4 points, shooting 50% from the field. He's a guy that I like the advanced stats like him as well. Pretty strong G League advanced numbers, 0.88 for a 19-year-old. For an 18-year-old. What's his long-term role? Is it as a center or as a power forward? I think it probably is going to be a center, but I could see him being a power forward. The three-point shooting is what needs to come around. He is still a long way off from being a strong contributor, probably 4 or 5 years away, but I do think that he can be a starter caliber player, a 26 to 28 minute a night guy who maybe can be a top 120 fantasy guy. So I've still got some faith in Smailagic. We're a long way off it coming to fruition, and it is more of a lottery ticket, but I still do have some faith in Alen Smailagic. That'll do it for me today, guys, with the Golden State Warriors. Tomorrow, I'll be back with a Charlotte Hornets season review, so look out on the Instagram stories and on Twitter to ask your questions about the Charlotte Hornets. Subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube. Leave it a thumbs up, give a comment, leave a review, all those good things, guys. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.